The world has shrunk.
We are in a period of remarkable tension.
Climate change and migration.
Emerging technologies.
Artificial intelligence.
Economic opportunities. Global health.
What is happening in Gaza.
Ukraine and Russia.
The situation in Sudan.
It's a messy world.
Mr. President, welcome to Chicago.
Chicago is a convergence of people and ideas and cultures from all over the world.
We are hoping that by listening to this conversation, we're then move into real advocacy and action.
Fight is about everyday work, about your everyday contribution. Even small steps matter.
We need to do something now.
This is about democracy.
Inclusion, real inclusion.
Listening to one another.
To what do you see as the path forward?
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Rebecca Wolf, and I am a senior lecturer at the Harris School for Public Policy and an associate at the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts at the University of Chicago. We're honored to have Ertharin Cousin and Cameron Hudson with us here tonight for this important discussion on Sudan, especially given that this month marks the 2-year anniversary of the current conflict. Ertharin Cousin is a distinguished fellow of global food and agriculture at the Chicago Council and the president and CEO of Food Systems for the Future. From 2012 to 2017, she served as executive director of the World Food Program, and previously she served as U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture in Rome and executive vice president of America's Second Harvest, now Feeding America. Cameron Hudson is a senior fellow in the Africa program at CSIS. His previous roles include senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and executive director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Center for the Prevention of Genocide. He has also held a number of government roles, including Chief of Staff to Presidential Special Envoys for Sudan, Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, and Intelligence Analyst in the Africa Directorate at the CIA. We will start off today's program with a discussion, after which we will have time for Q&A with the audience. Please hold your questions until the Q&A portion of the program, when you'll be able to ask your questions directly. For those joining virtually, you can submit your questions online at ccga.live. Before we begin, we would like to remind everyone that today's program is on the record, and any views expressed by speakers we host here at the Council are their own and do not reflect any institutional positions. With that, we'll start with our first question. So, let's start with getting a kind of a frame, like an understanding of the overall context. So the crisis in Sudan did not emerge overnight. Cameron, could you briefly explain the key events that led to the current conflict between the Sudanese Armed Forces, who we'll refer to as probably SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF? What do we need to know about Sudan's political landscape or history to understand today's humanitarian emergency?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure. We could go back to the 1956 founding of Sudan to talk about the antecedents to this conflict. I will go back just to 2019 because I think that's the most sort of germane period. Sudan lived under a brutal military dictatorship from 1989 until 2019 under the rule of an Islamist leader, Omar al-Bashir, who was, I think, widely despised within the country and even within the region, and someone with whom the United States had a very tense relationship for many years, given the brutality of his rule. He was removed in 2019 by the military, prompted by several months of popular protests, pro-democracy protests by Sudanese civilians. It was a peaceful uprising that removed Bashir. Essentially, the military removed him to save themselves, however. So while Bashir was removed, the dictator was removed, the regime that he had created largely remained intact. There was a transitional period that was negotiated by the United States and African and European partners that brought in a period of transitional rule under a nominally democratic prime minister that was intended to lead to democratic elections and the transition of the country into a more democratic dispensation. During that period of time, the transitional government set about trying to dismantle the vestiges of the former regime, removing key members of the military, removing the opaque finances that the country was shrouded in. And as they did that, and as they kind of got closer and closer to the elements of power and money that the military largely depended upon, the military became very nervous about this transition. At the same time, the military is vying for supremacy within the country with this other, essentially conventional military that was created called the Rapid Support Forces. This was a group that President Bashir created from the Janjaweed militia. So many of you may remember during the genocide in Darfur, the military created or stood up this Janjaweed militia to help them fight their counterinsurgency campaign against African Darfuri tribes in that region. When that war ended, he essentially normalized or regularized the Janjaweed, turning them into the Rapid Support Forces. By the time 2020, 2021, this transition is going on, you essentially have two conventional armies in Sudan. And one country with two armies is not going to stand for very long. But the one thing that kept these forces unified was this idea that these civilian leaders in the country are getting close to our interests. And so in October of 2021, those two armies jointly overthrew the transitional government and installed themselves to essentially run the country. That lasted for about a year and a half. But I think the challenge was when there was no kind of civilian intermediary mediating between these two armies, tensions between them grew about who would run the country, who would have access to the benefits, and those tensions eventually erupted 2 years ago this month when war broke out between these two armies in the country.
Before you go on, and a Sudan hand who has the experience that you do, I'm always hesitant to intervene. But I think that it's important as you talk about the challenge of Sudan that we don't ever forget the division between the Black African Sudanese and the Arab Sudanese, and the effect that that has on the divisions in the country, the poverty in the country, and this humanitarian crisis that I'm hoping that we'll talk about here tonight. Because that's a overhang onto all of the political issues that you've just so eloquently described.
Absolutely.
And speaking, so one, Cameron, in your remarks, I'm just reminded of how hopeful we were not that long ago about Sudan. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. Millions displaced, a significant portion of the country in need of humanitarian aid when humanitarian aid is becoming less available. And so, Ertharin, despite the world's largest humanitarian crisis, Sudan received significantly less media coverage than Gaza and Ukraine. We were just talking in the green room about what happened in Zam Zam camp that got very little media attention compared to what we see for the other crises right now. What contributes to this attention deficit? And what can be done to bring more awareness to the crisis?
And that was why I wanted to intervene on the history piece of this, because what contributes to this is the disparities between the populations in Sudan and the long-term challenges of the refugee camps in Darfur and the population that depends upon, that was displaced before internally displaced before this crisis began, and the effect that the fighting in different parts of the country have had on that population, and the lack of interest by the international community with all of the other crises. Some would say that we are suffering from an international crisis fatigue with Ukraine and Gaza and ongoing challenges in Yemen and Afghanistan, that there is little interest in what is happening in Sudan. And that the neighborhood that Sudan lives in, when you think of Chad, South Sudan, and not including Egypt, because that's another entirely different conversation. But from a foreign policy, national security standpoint for Europe and the U.S., there is little interest in the country from those perspectives for most of those who would raise their hand regarding and invest in the humanitarian response as required. And I think it's particularly, and I would love to hear Cameron's thoughts on this, it is particularly challenging when the U.S. that has played such a significant role in the investment in the humanitarian response in Sudan and the leadership that the U.S. bipartisan leadership that the previous Save Darfur activities and the Save Darfur coalition maintained doesn't exist now. And as a result, I don't want to say no one cares, but the reality is very few people do. And there, as a result, there's been very little media attention. And it is 5 stories in 2 minutes when it is given media coverage. And whether it is the ongoing fighting or Zam Zam that just happened in the last 5 days, that we are continuing to see the loss of life, the violence to women and children, the lack of access to food, and there is a declared IPC certified famine now in several of the areas, without the attendant conversation amongst the global community.
And I guess you ended on the IPC, and so why has famine hit Sudan so hard, and the food system collapsed so dramatically over this time? Again, not getting the headlines that we see from the other conflicts, but we're seeing, the amount of and undernourishment to such degrees. Why is that happening, and what needs to be done to try to be able to serve the people who are in desperate need for help?
Sure. The primary drivers of hunger, any place in the world, are conflict and climate. Sudan is faced with both. And as a result, you have seen lack of productive agriculture throughout the duration of the conflict. As well as even before the conflict, there was a reduction in agricultural production that even stemmed back before COVID. And with COVID, there was lack of investment. Ukraine had an effect on the prices of imported food into Sudan. And so you have the climate elements that affect. And then when you superimpose the conflict element onto the the lack of agricultural production, and then the inability of humanitarians to respond. A humanitarian response requires pretty much 5 factors. 1, presence. You need to have the people on the ground to support the work that is necessary. You need capacity to perform. You need timely funding. And I say timely and adequate funding when we've had neither. I spoke to the leadership of WFP just today, and they are in a position now where they believe that they're at a potential for failure of the humanitarian response, not just food, and not just WFP, but UNICEF and the other international organizations, because of lack of access to funding. The entire humanitarian response is underfunded. And then the last piece is, of course, even if you had the money, the people, and the means, if you don't have the protection of the humanitarian responders, you cannot access those most in need. And that is why you so often see food challenges, hunger challenges, malnutrition challenges during crisis, because of those factors. And all of them are at play in Sudan. And I'll just end by saying we, as a community of actors in the humanitarian development space, support localization of humanitarian response, as well as development activity, but particularly for humanitarian response. And when you have local actors, which we have successfully empowered many local organizations in Sudan to meet the humanitarian needs of the population, but then those are also the people that are most vulnerable when there is a conflict, because they're also citizens. They are also parts of the community. And so they are easily targeted and they have been in this crisis, and limiting their ability to perform. And when you have the culmination of all of those factors, this is a case study. We could get together and write a book on why humanitarian response fails during conflict.
I mean, I was looking at data today about the number of aid workers killed in various countries, and Sudan was number 3 in terms of the most aid worker deaths in 2023 after Gaza and South Sudan. Mm-hmm. And so, making it much harder for whether local organizations or internationals hiring locals to actually be there and operate under those conditions. But we also see in this situation of direct interference by the forces on both sides of preventing humanitarian access and targeting food systems.
Sure. And let me just say this, and then I'll stop. But I think that there's been widespread looting of the warehouses for humanitarian and food intended for humanitarian distribution. You've had over 50 warehouses that have been destroyed, broken into, food stolen, and destroyed, limiting the ability of those humanitarian actors who do have access to have the tools that they need to support the response. And so that is also a variable that is often an issue for discussion. We can talk about the parties in a humanitarian crisis limiting access by either the threats that we've talked about to those who perform, or by the destruction or the seizing of the food or the other humanitarian tools, whether it's water or the other. We've even seen situations where things like blankets and tents have been stolen, and you have families who are living in the camps that, as they move into new camps, living outside of camps on the street because there are no humanitarian tents or other tools for them when they move into a new area because of the pillaging by the forces involved in the conflict in the humanitarian tools.
Well, and as we were talking earlier, and I saw some heads nod when I mentioned what happened in Zam Zam Camp Cameron. You talked a little bit about how that likely is making the response that much harder, given the second order displacement that's happened. I don't know if you want to share a bit more of that. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the case of Zam Zam is one that I think for a long time we always thought was a kind of worst case scenario that's now playing out. So Zam Zam Camp is a camp that was created by the United Nations during the first Darfur genocide 20 years ago, actually. In 2004 it was created. It's on the outskirts of the capital of Darfur, El Fasher. It was the camp that when I was in the U.S. government, we used to go to that camp quite frequently because it was quite close to the airport. So when you had very limited time, you would go and you'd tour Zam Zam Camp. When we opened that camp, when the UN and with U.S. funding opened that camp in 2004, it had a population of about 250,000 people that had fled fighting in the Darfur region. As of last week, it had a population of about 750,000 people. I think you have to, so that's the size of a pretty good sized American city.
Yeah. Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. But with obviously none of the services of an American city that has grown, organically, essentially, in the desert. Many of the people there are born there. That's the only place that they've ever known. I mean, there are 20-year-olds who were born in Zam Zam Camp who have only known life in an IDP camp in Sudan. So what we know is about 400,000 of those people have fled the camp. It was shelled with mortars by the Rapid Support Forces last week for no apparent reason, because it's not a military target. There isn't recruitment going on. It's not, residents of the camp have not taken sides in the conflict. They're sheltering there, looking for safety. But about 400,000, we think, have fled. And I think one of the big differences, just to pick up on something you were saying earlier, I think one of the big differences that we face today is, as bad as things were during the genocide 20 years ago, there was access. There were people that were going into Darfur that were coming out with images of what was going on. We could see and hear the stories of those people. We're by and large not seeing or hearing any of those stories coming out. We have satellite imagery, which has, given us one dimension on the conflict, but it doesn't get to the kind of more personal narratives and personal understanding of what's happening at a human level on the ground. And I think when we talk about, why isn't this getting more attention, or why isn't the international community more motivated to do something? I think it's hard to get motivated when all you have are satellite images of destruction. It feels very impersonal. It doesn't have the kind of the presence and the touch and the feel that I think people need to be moved to take some kind of action. So many of these people right now are fleeing into the desert, so really inhospitable conditions, walking for 50 miles to the closest town where there isn't active conflict going on. Many of them are not able to make it. Those who can are, on sort of death's door when they arrive. And when they do arrive, there is no United Nations. There is no international, humanitarian response to receive them. And so they are really being left to their own devices. Again, 20 years ago in Darfur, there was a 25,000 man, woman, UN peacekeeping force that had been deployed. It was at the time the largest deployment of humanitarian actors in the world. And today that humanitarian response has been reduced to really a kind of skeleton crew. There is no large scale international response inside of Darfur right now.
Can I ask a question on that, though? If we talked about the lack of financial resources for the humanitarian response, and you've spoken on the comparison to the peacekeeping force that we had 25 years ago. the capital that is necessary for a peacekeeping force. Would the United Nations even have the capacity to stand up a peacekeeping force to protect the refugees if that was the intention of the international community?
I think the short answer is no. I think in the last 2 years of this conflict, there's been virtually no discussion about what in the field is called protection of civilians, right? So there has been absolutely no conversation. If you look across Africa, what you're looking at, whether it's in South Sudan or in Mali or in various other parts of Africa, Congo, all of those peacekeeping operations are being closed, right? We paid at the time, which seems like a bargain at the time, it was $1 billion a year to deploy peacekeepers to Darfur. The United States is responsible for 25% of the UN peacekeeping budget. Recent announcements suggest that we're about to start paying zero towards that, not 25% any longer. So there is no capacity, either financial capacity or I think political will right now to even entertain the idea of deploying peacekeepers. And again, when you don't have those peacekeepers, it wasn't like the peacekeepers were doing battle with the Janjaweed, but what the peacekeepers were doing was they were escorting that humanitarian assistance that was coming into the country. So at a bare minimum, the assistance was able to move in, which we don't have today.
And a follow-up question I had, which initially I thought about it in Ertharin's comments, but then you mentioned that you weren't there doesn't seem to be a tactical reason for what RSF did in Zam Zam. And I often think of insurgencies, counterinsurgencies using aid to gain support. And so I'm trying to understand, what do you see as a potential endgame? If for RSF in this, if it doesn't seem to be about gaining support?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that the challenge with the RSF is, it is not driven by a single ideology. It's not driven by a single cause or purpose other than its own survival, really. And so, and bear in mind too that the RSF today is constituted probably only about 50% of Sudanese. They have recruited from Arab tribes across Central Africa and West Africa. So it's almost better to think of the RSF more as a mercenary army than a kind of nationalist army. And that explains a lot of their behavior. So the stories that we have now been able to construct coming out of Khartoum, because Khartoum, the capital, has recently been retaken by the army. And so for the first time in 2 years, we're able to access the capital. We're able to see the damage and destruction. And what we have seen is destruction for the sake of destruction and looting for the sake of earning your salary, right? So everywhere where the RSF has gone, it has been for their actual personal financial benefit. It hasn't been because they want to control the levers of power. It has been literally to take the copper out of the walls to sell on black markets in other parts of the country. So the destruction of the camp in Zam Zam is, I think, in one part, ethnic cleansing. It's to target minority tribes. So the RSF is largely Arab tribes, but of African descent. So as opposed to Arab tribes of Arab descent, which is largely what the army leadership is comprised of. But they have every bit as much kind of racism towards minority African tribes as the army does. And so much of the targeting of Zam Zam and other communities in Darfur is to purge those African tribes from the area and to impose their will. There's not a lot of wealth to steal from residents of an IDP camp. So it really is about purging those communities from Sudan.
And I mean, this brings,
the idea that I go back to the lack of protection for civilians, because to me that is the challenge here. I will leave the politics to those who are much better at it. You're right. There's not much to steal from a household living in an IDP camp, or those who are living in the desert fleeing an IDP camp, or in the area from which they originated. There is, however, the opportunity for particularly mercenaries to use the area you have gold mines, you have access to other countries for black market trading, for that where there is the opportunity for financial gain from those who this is what their reasoning for the conflict is financial gain and opportunity for control and power. So the civilians suffer as a result. They may not get anything from them, and they become the victims of the opportunity to seize land and seize power. How do you think that? Do you think that there is an idea beyond genocide? Because you can't. The international community will not stand by and allow them to completely eliminate I'm going to hope the international community, but they will continue to move forward. So is that more of their goal? Is the access to power and natural resources and other methods for financial gain?
Yeah. I think it's manifold, right? I think that I think at a base understanding, it's worth kind of reflecting on the patterns of violence and power in the country going back to the start of the country in 1956, because the Sudanese elites believe that they are descended from the Egyptian pharaohs, right? You talk to any good Sudanese Arab, they will tell you that there are more Egyptian pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, right? That the center of pharaonic culture is Sudan, it's not Egypt, right? And that the military leadership of the country is descended from that tradition, right? So that is kind of the center of the elitism that exists in the country, and that all power from the capital radiated out into these vast peripheral areas. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind also that Sudan, prior to the separation of South Sudan, was the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. Okay, it was the largest country in Africa. Darfur is the size of Texas or France, however you like to define it. So we're talking about a vast, vast area. And so the capital was where all the power, all of the money, the wealth, the culture, the art, everything was concentrated there. The wars that took place in Sudan, whether in South Sudan or Darfur, were all in these peripheral areas of the country, far from the capital. The unique feature of this conflict is that it has started in the capital, it has destroyed the capital. It's the first time that Sudanese elites have ever seen conflict. I can remember going to Darfur during the genocide there, and people in Khartoum asking me, "Oh, what's it like in Darfur?" It's not like there was rail service or convenient flight service. Nobody would ever go to Darfur. There was no reason to go to Darfur ever. It was the country was very divorced from its peripheral areas. The RSF is an army of these peripheral areas. And so to the extent that they have a logic, it is the destruction of the central state. It is the destruction of the elitist Arab state, which has visited violence upon them for generations and generations. The army, whether it's the colonial army that the British stood up in the 1920s, whether it's the Arab army that inherited power from the British in 1956, whether it's the army that the Egyptians have trained in their image since then, it has been about pacifying these rural peripheral areas, as they call them, of the country. And the RSF has recruited its mercenary army from these peripheral areas. So to the extent that it has a motivation, it is to destroy the power holders that have been just trying to destroy them and divide them. Now, obviously, there's other motivations in terms of controlling wealth, controlling gold mines in Darfur. I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that when you control Darfur, you control the border with Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, and South Sudan. So you control customs and border, right? You control smuggling. You control all the commerce going back and forth across 4 different national borders. So there's revenue generation that comes from controlling that territory as well. So it's this mix, though, of trying to destroy the state itself, which is why we have now seen destruction of the National Archives, destruction of the National Museum, destruction of birth records, anything that defined the state, destruction of private property records, right? Why would you do that? Why would you go and destroy those kinds of documents? Well, it's because they are trying to undo the wealth and the power structure that underpin the entire country.
So I have so many follow-up questions now, but and I'm going to try to combine them a little bit. So, I mean, one of the things to the point of like why it's hard to get attention in Sudan is that there's all these crises, and what we find is generally crises get on the list, the OCHA list, and these days very rarely come off. And so we're just adding more and more, and then the limited funds have to be spread out. So in order to deal with the humanitarian disaster, we're going to have to eventually find a way to end this conflict, whether it's militarily or politically. If you could speak a bit about what are potential endgames here, whether militarily or politically, and to touch on, there was a conference in London just a week ago, but there are also a lot of other international players interested in the outcome here.
You want to start?
No, I don't. You do it.
Well, I mean, I'm quite pessimistic about what the outcome looks like, and I think it's again, I think it's worth kind of juxtaposing where we are today to where we were, and what many of us think of as a conventional response to conflict in a place like Africa, right? Because I think for a long time, or at least it's sort of in the post-Cold War period, there was this sense that the United States, under both Democrats and Republicans, took an active role as, I hate to say the kind of, world police, but played that role, if not policing, then at least peacemaking and mediating. And so there was a time, I mean, again, I went to the United Nations with President Bush, President Obama, who convened, big UN conferences on Sudan, whether it was on South Sudan or on Darfur, using the power of the presidency of the United States to convene the international community and to regulate, in many ways, the competition among various actors who have a stake in the outcome in this conflict and other conflicts, right? Today, that competition is very much alive in Sudan. Sudan has 600 miles of Red Sea coastline, which, in recent years has become even more strategic than it was before. It sits across the Red Sea from Yemen and the Gulf Peninsula. So it's an area of the world that a lot of people are very, very focused on, and Arab states in particular have an interest in controlling the western borders of the Red Sea, given the tension on the eastern side of the Red Sea. So whether it's Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Egypt, 20 years ago, these were not countries that even had a seat at the table when we were trying to make peace in a place like Sudan. And today, they are the ones that are driving the conflict, and they are the ones who will have to be on board with whatever the outcome is, because they all have a stake. They have a financial stake, they have a political stake, they have a geostrategic stake in who runs the country and whether they have access to Red Sea ports there, whether they have access to the agricultural production of Sudan. There isn't a loaf of bread in the Gulf that isn't produced with wheat from Sudan. There isn't a lamb that isn't eaten in the Gulf that isn't produced in Sudan. It is the breadbasket of these Gulf Arab states. And so they look at it as a food security issue on top of a geostrategic issue, on top of a political issue. And so so they have, I think, probably more skin in the game today in a very real, tangible sense than I think the United States or European allies do. So my kind of pessimistic take is that there is likely to be some kind of elite deal among these outside states, and that what we are likely to see are the actors in Sudan essentially bargain away the most productive assets of the country, whether it's the agricultural fields, the gold mines, the lithium mines, port access. That's the tradable commodity that they have to appease these other regional powers, which are fueling the war, which are selling the weapons, which are benefiting from this. And I don't think that the United States is right now positioned to play a lead role. It could perhaps mediate among Arab states, but again, it would have to prioritize that mediation over other things that it wants to get from Saudi Arabia, from UAE, from Egypt, from Turkey.
Let me just add on to that. The challenge of not having the United States at the table for that type of brokered peacemaking. The U.S. is, for all of our faults, we take a significant interest in the civilian outcomes. The education for children, the rights of women, the access to food and assistance and support by vulnerable populations. Those issues are not part of the conversation today with the countries that are sitting at the table. And that should concern us all. Because we have a generation, as you said, who are living in, whether it's in Darfur or any of the surrounding areas that are in a camp, in an IDP camp in Darfur or any of the surrounding areas, that this is the only life they know. And what they knew before this conflict began, they did have that humanitarian support. There were schools, there were hospitals, there were the kind of structural systems in place to protect civilians. This is what should concern us, is that when that grand bargain is struck and those issues are not included, what happens to that population? And do you truly have a resilient peace if none of those issues are addressed?
I think we know the answer to that.
I think that's a good place to open it up for Q&A. And so I think there'll be a mic that, yes. And so, yeah, we've put up the mic, and if people want to stand.
I remember reading in 2004 and 2005 about the coming election to divide Sudan. Mm-hmm. And I was reading the Christian Science Monitor at that time. And they were talking about all the armaments coming into the country. Mm-hmm. Armaments. But something that hasn't been mentioned, at least I didn't hear it, oil. Oil is in South Sudan, right on the border between the two. How does that impact what's going on?
Who wants to take?
Are we doing one at a time, or?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Oil is I think a marginal asset in this conflict right now. I think that over a period of time, there was a civil war in South Sudan in 2013, mm-hmm. which destroyed a lot of the oil infrastructure. So they went from producing about 250,000 barrels of oil a day to under 100,000. I think it's like 70 or 80,000 barrels of oil a day, which is not a lot of money. The thing that we haven't talked about is the new asset that has emerged in the last decade in Sudan, which is, I think, fueling a lot of the conflict, is gold. Right now, the country is earning about $4 billion a year from gold. About half of that is being earned by the RSF. in areas under their control, and the other half of that, these are kind of gross figures, is being earned by the government. And so with each side earning about $2 billion a year in gold, which far outshadows anything from the oil, that's, I think, the principal driver of buying weapons today.
The oil infrastructure is what you just told us.
Yes, by and large, yeah.
The South Sudanese, the conflict in South Sudan.
Yes, the
was
conflict in South Sudan.
Because that's where the oil was, up in the northern section of South Sudan.
Correct, yeah.
Or is. It's still there.
So would you say that along the Red Sea and the Gulf course, there's no farm products coming from Ethiopia or Ertharin or even farther south along the African east coast of Africa that is being sent north? Or are those farm products being, stopped by gangs from, like we've had all the problems with cargo ships being taken over by what do you want to call them? Pirates?
Yeah. No, I think that the reason why so much of Sudan's agricultural production goes to the Gulf is because of the kind of Arab connection between them, which they don't have in Kenya, and they don't have in Ethiopia or Eritrea, right? First of all, the capacity for production is far higher for the crops, for sorghum, for wheat in Sudan than it is in those other places. So it just produces more of that. But it was, frankly, a bit of history. It was the Rockefeller Foundation and the Green Revolution that came to Sudan in 1956 and created this massive, the largest agricultural production in all of Africa in this part of Sudan.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that view that there is land in Ethiopia and parts of Eritrea that have the capacity to perform at the level of Sudan. The investment in agricultural production, particularly large-scale agricultural production, has been in Sudan. More irrigation is in Sudan, which allows for the productivity that you've described.
Yeah. No authorities to buy those crops to bring it to those who are starving.
Well, a lot of the crops, ironically, are exported for hard currency earnings, and they have long-term contracts with those Arab states who, again, see it as their own food security issue. So there is a certain, irony that but there is enough food in Sudan to feed the Sudanese. A lot of it has been affected and shut in by the fighting in the last 2 years.
Well, and I was talking to a colleague earlier today that was saying how with geospatial data, they're seeing production go down because of people can't get out to the farms and so forth. So they're still able to produce enough, but it's mostly going out.
A lot of it is going out.
It was going out before the conflict,
yes,
right? And because those contracts have been ongoing.
But if there's a less supply, where is it going? I guess
it will go out. The reality is that it is back. It's just as you talk about the gold, agricultural production that is harvested is another form of gold for those who control those.
Well, a lot of that farmland is owned not by Sudanese interests, but by Saudi interests and Emirati
and
interests.
I was about to say UAE.
Okay,
so it might be in Sudan, but it's owned by those Gulf state actors.
There's the reason why there isn't that much interest in Sudan is because we don't have a large Sudanese or people that come from the Darfur region living in, say, North America and Europe that would normally promote what's going on in the region.
Let me just say, when we had the Save Darfur, there were no more Sudanese in the United States than there are today. Yet you had a massive and very successful coalition that was built across the churches. And one of the things that's interesting, if you remember back to when the Save Darfur Coalition was created, much of that was led by leaders like Elie Wiesel and the Jewish community that brought together the churches. And there were some 180 or 190 different churches that were faith-based organizations that were involved, as well as bipartisanism. So the politics here in the United States have changed. There's other issues that they're focused on.
Now, with Sudan, when you have so many competing conflicts, then you need it. Then if you don't have a community, then that puts a group of people at a disadvantage when it comes to lobbying for support.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one other aspect that I would just remind people of too, which was, speaking as somebody who was in the government in 2004 when the Darfur genocide was happening, that was the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And the Rwandan genocide, there was a kind of long shadow that it cast over President Bush, but also I think just the sort of U.S. policymakers and international policymakers. It was such a stain on humanity and our collective consciousness that we developed, and Samantha Power is one of the people who wrote her book, A Problem from Hell. This idea emerged that we can predict where genocide is going to happen and we can prevent it from happening. And not only can we prevent it, it is our responsibility to prevent it from happening, right? And so that goes back to the Elie Wiesel motivation and what we saw from Jewish and Christian communities rallying for Save Darfur. The idea was it could be prevented and we had a responsibility to prevent it. That was a very much an animating factor in our diplomacy and others' diplomacy at the time.
Thank you.
And so, I think, there was that movement of calling it out as a genocide, and we didn't have much time to talk about it tonight, but we're not talking about it as a genocide in the same way today than we did back in 2004. Yeah. So I'm going to take a couple online questions and then come back. To both of you, how are the recent cuts, both at USAID and now at state, impacting U.S. counterterrorism strategy in the Horn of Africa? And particularly how it would affect ability to do work, say, with RSF given the government so far had been backing the Sudanese forces?
Well, I think it's worth reminding people that Sudan from 1994 onward was on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Osama bin Laden was hosted by the former regime for 3 years. He planned the New York World Trade Center attacks and the bombing of the USS Cole from Khartoum. So it was, I think, rightfully on that list when it was added. After 9/11, the Sudanese kind of made a break from funding international terrorism when they were given the choice by the Bush administration. So I think that there's a real concern right now for a lot of people that you could see some of those forces come back into control in Sudan and that it could go back to some of those old ways. The military has vowed not to allow that to happen. But, in fairness, we don't know how things will play out going forward in Sudan.
And we know ungoverned spaces is often where these groups emerge.
Yeah, I mean, Sudan could possibly be a failed state in some number of months or years. And when that happens, whether you call it a Libya-like scenario or a Somalia-like scenario, it can be a breeding ground for those kinds of activities. And I think that's obviously a concern.
Yeah, and as I said before, presence is critical in counterterrorism activities, just as it is in humanitarian response. And our inability to have boots on the ground, those with context and have the ability to develop information sources, is to the detriment of our ability to understand what is actually happening in those places and spaces.
I had a question regarding what do you think it would take for Sudan or the crisis in Sudan to be resolved? Do you think that people need to come in from the outside? And as you said, maybe it's a failed state. So does it need to be split up in some way? Or do you think that people in Sudan need to, get together and rise up and create a new government. And just on the role of predicting conflict, do you think that AI will play a role in terms of natural language processing?
I didn't see that last one coming.
Yeah.
I mean, just on the conflict resolution in the country, the people of Sudan rose up in support of a democratic government, and what they called for was freedom, peace, and justice. That was sort of the slogan of the revolution at the time. They did not get a lot of support from the outside community to the extent that the United States was supportive. I think most of our support was rhetorical and less practical, quite frankly. Because again, I think the United States has really moved away, even prior to this administration, had been moving away from the kind of nation-building efforts that we saw even a decade before. So I think it's going to be a difficult time for the Sudanese to regain the foundations of that revolution. And I think, frankly, speaking with a lot of Sudanese. The focus right now is on much more basic needs and wants. It's about returning home. It's about, finding, rebuilding. It's about those kinds of things. It's about ending the conflict in a way that allows people to return home. I think that's we can't forget there are 13 million people who are displaced, 26 million people who need humanitarian assistance to survive. So those are the critical priorities right now. And I think, unfortunately, sadly, the aspirations for a better government are probably, I think, on the horizon. They're not the kind of here and now.
Thank you for doing this. I am Sudanese. I was born in Sudan, sort of raised in the U.S. in Sudan too. And honestly, this is the most coverage or information that I was able to get in the last couple of years, which is just heartbreaking. And so I actually had to respond to a gentleman that asked about the community earlier, and then I have a question for everyone else. But as being part of the Sudanese community, as you just said, we've been so focused on the day-to-day urgent needs. And I'm talking about feeding our families. So the community is more focused on how do I get my aunt, my uncle, my cousin fed and keep them safe, right? And that's where our money, that's where our finances are going. That's where our, resources, time, and energy is going, unfortunately, right now, because we're not getting that aid from the international community. But I choose to be optimistic. My question to you is, what is the role of this community, the diaspora, the international Sudanese community, and the international community long term? How can we actually rebuild this? It's eventually going to come to an end. But what is 2 years from now? What is 5 years from now? What can I and the rest of my community and everyone else here focus on 2 or 5 years from now?
One of the issues when we talk about development and the role of diaspora is always in the rebuilding. We know that diasporan contributions to families is greater than ODA on an annual basis in almost every country around the globe. And the opportunity for rebuilding that is not affected by the geopolitics of the world that we live in today, must be led by the diasporan community. This is much of what you're hearing from Africa across the board now, particularly it was in post-COVID, is this is a time for Africa to save itself. And for the communities outside, the diasporan communities outside of the continent, to provide additional resources. It is not to suggest that there's not a role or responsibility for the international community, that there's not a desire for additional ODA, but there's also an opportunity for investment that should be seized, particularly as you talk about between 5 and 10 years from now.
I would just add, I was in Sudan a few years ago for a project that we were doing, and we met with a group of Sudanese youth. Youth in Africa is a very flexible word. There were probably 40-year-olds in the room, but they, one of the questions that we asked of them was, how are you making a difference in your country? This was before the revolution. And what struck me, this room of 15 or 20 youth, was, they were doing startups, they were doing, community service work, they were starting businesses, they were doing all sorts of things, but nobody was joining the government to make a difference in the country. Because what they had learned living under a dictatorship is that government is bad. Government is predatory. Government is corrupt. And so that former regime taught an entire generation or multiple generations of people that if you want to impact your community, you don't go into the kind of formal government structure. You can't change it from the inside. We have this idea, this maybe idealistic notion in the United States that you can change things from the inside. But no one seems to have that that idea in Sudan. And I think that's very discouraging, frankly, because as we think about who is going to assume responsibility for this country, who's going to take over, what are our alternatives to these two, army generals that are vying for control over the country, there is right now no obvious civilian alternative or civilian, grouping that people in the international community or the diaspora can invest in to say, these are the people that we want to see running the country in 2 years or 5 years. So until we can help identify, and I think the diaspora is best placed to help identify and to promote and to advocate for Sudanese taking control and standing up and, creating a platform and an agenda for what governance should look like going into the future. Because if they don't, then we only have generals who are, and they have a plan, right? Be assured that they have a plan for the future of the country, and we won't like that plan. But if we don't have an alternative, and if the diaspora cannot rally to create that alternative, I think it's going to be, it's going to be another military solution, unfortunately.
I think that's a very optimistic note to end on, because what I have seen is that countries that are able to move out of this have people who've been educated abroad and have come back, or the technocrats who want to build a country for all its people. And so having that is maybe what we can hope for with Sudan's future. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I apologize. But thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you, Cameron and Ertharin, for being here.
Thank you.